In this unit of our InDesign CS6 course, we're going to talk about the units and increments, grids, and guides and pasteboard layouts in our Preferences dialog box. Let's start with units and increments. As we work with this, we have options for setting the origin for where the ruler unit's going to happen. We can build that in a spread, which is the default setting. So if you have two pages set side by side, the 0 point would be at the spot in between the two pages of that reader spread. By the page, which by default sets the 0 point to the upper left-hand corner of each individual page, or along the spine, which, if I'm setting a bound book, would basically build that inside the center of the spine area, wherever that would be bound. We can set that for spread. We'll just leave the default setting right here. We also have options here for setting how those ruler points are going to be defined along the horizontal and vertical ruler. You may remember, if you start with the first chapter of our InDesign course, that we changed this from the original printer's measures of picas to inches for both our horizontal and vertical rulers. Let's talk about what we've got here. Points and picas are what are known as printer's measures. There are 6 picas to an inch, or 72 points to an inch. That translates into 12 points for each individual pica. These are great measures if you're familiar with working with printer's units, because they allow you to measure halves, quarters, and thirds of any unit of measure using the exact same measure. That's why InDesign CS6 sets up with these printer's measures by default. But if you're not familiar with that, that's okay. We can change that to other options. We can set it for inches, like we did in the first chapter of our InDesign course. We could set it in inches decimal. So instead of defining halves and quarters and eighths of an inch, it would define that as 1.1 or 1.3 or 1.5 inches. Inches decimal are very handy when you're designing forms, for example, working with InDesign. Otherwise, the regular inches measure is really pretty comfortable. If you're working with metric standards, we can set our rulers to measure in millimeters or centimeters. If we're designing in custom publication terms, we can set type in Ciceros or agates. If you're designing an interactive publication or a digital publication, we can define that in pixel terms, as we're defining that space in our horizontal and vertical rulers. Or what we can do is we could set that as custom. And if we did that, that would allow us to set whatever rule, in this case you'll notice by default, in printer's measures of points for how we would define where those individual tick marks would fall. Let's go back to the inches that we set for our measurements in the first chapter of our InDesign course and leave that there. Other units. We have options to set the stroke in points or in millimeters, depending on whether you're working in the metric measures or you're using the default definition of how thick a stroke should be in points terms. We're going to leave that for points in the default setting. Now, you may remember that I said when we were talking about picas and points that points were 12 points to a pica or 72 points to the inch. That's actually a little bit of a simplification. If you're really going to be very precise or hardcore about that, the traditional measure actually makes that for some reason just a quarter point more in that measurement, 72.27 points to the inch. By default, we'll go for the PostScript definition just because it makes the math easier in our lives. Keyboard increments. This basically talks about what happens when we're bumping or working with parameters with our cursor tools. That's the arrows that sit between the typewriter side and the calculator side of a full keyboard, or setting rules when we're bumping information up for changing type parameters working in our InDesign documents. By default, the cursor key If you click it to the right or left, up and down, we'll move that 0.0139 inches. That actually corresponds to 1 point in our printer's measure. There are a number of areas when we're working with InDesign that the program will revert to printer's measures, even if that's not the parameter we've got built in. If we're using keyboard shortcuts to bump up size leading in our type, it's going to do that by default as it's set here in 2-point increments. Similarly, if we're moving type in baseline shift to move up or down, as we set those settings using keyboard shortcuts, that happens in 2-point increments. And if we're using kerning and tracking, the default setting for packing that in a little bit closer or bringing it back apart as we're working with keyboard shortcuts would make that happen in 20 thousandths or 1/500th of an M increments. That's pretty tight and pretty precise definitions. We can change the rules for any of these, but we're not going to do that in this case for this InDesign course. Let's go to grids. And with the grids, what this does is this offers us options for defining how a grid background would be defined within our InDesign documents. Grids are very handy if you're doing technical documentation to measure up to scale, or if you're working with forms, in that it allows you very precise views of where you're positioning multiple individual elements when you're working within an InDesign document. In the baseline grid, which we can set up whenever we go to that View pull-down menu and say Show Grid, we have options for defining the color, and we got all kinds of colors that we can define for what that grid line is going to show like, or the grid's positions as we're working with it. We have a spot that defines where that grid is going to start on the page, defined relative to either the top of the page or the top of the margin areas that we set when we first created our InDesign document, or if we decided to change those rules for the margin as we were working within that InDesign document after we've already created it. We can set what distance those individual increments happen. In this case, it's 12 points, 1 pica or 1/6 of an inch. And then there are view threshold options that let me know where I'm at to see this grid. If I decide, for example, to make my page larger than 75%, or if I chose 200%, when I went to a display view percentage or zoom that was higher than that point, what would happen is it wouldn't actually show that grid. We'll live with the default setting that we have here at 75%. The document grid color we can set as well, and as I said, we've got all kinds of options for doing that. And then as we define that in the document, we can set the rules for where those grid lines are going to be and how many subdivisions or subsets that will be built inside of that. So when we set a grid line, it would draw a perfectly horizontal or vertical line, and then subdivisions, it would show small dots in beside those grid lines to define subpoints or subsections built within whatever we set for our document grid. Let's go to the guides and pasteboard layout now. And as we do that, we've got options for how we can set colors for our margins. Remember, as we first talked about that was at magenta or purple. Column guides, which show up as a violet or a deep purple. Bleed areas, which showed up as that strong warm red, or slug lines, grid blue. When we have a preview background, so if we change in our layout from the normal to the preview view, it would show against a light gray background in this case to give us a strong contrast. And then smart guides, when we're lining things up, those pop-up guides that let us know when we're matching up with alignment to other elements or to relative positions on the page, would show in this case on grid green. Guide options. When I get within, in this case, 4 pixels to a very close edge to any of those guides that we show, what will happen is it'll snap it or automatically align it to the grid position that we're talking about along that guide. You can almost feel it as a magnetic pull that takes it and snaps it from placing that very close to right on that guide if you have snap to guides or snap to grid selected. Over here we have a checkbox for guides in back. Let me explain what that does. When you take graphic elements and you place them right along the edge of a guide, and you place your cursor right along where that guide and that graphic element meet, by default what happens is if you hold the mouse button down, it's going to grab the guide first. Now you can fix that by clicking again, holding the control key when you're working on the PC, or the command key if you're working on the Mac, to make sure that you pick up the graphic element instead of picking up that guide that you laid down. One way to fix that so you don't have to use that command or control option is to click this little checkbox for guides in back. And what that does is now when you get to a spot where an element or a frame matches up right against the guide, that by default when you select it, it's going to select the graphic element instead of selecting that guide. We're going to check that box and we're going to leave it set that way for the rest of our InDesign course. Smart Guide Options. In this case, what we're doing is we're setting the rules for where we want things to be set. Align to Object Center, which means when I get the center of something aligned with the center of another object, a smart guide is going to appear. In this case, that checkbox is also set for when they're lined up along their edges. When we set specific smart dimensions and smart spacing, it'll automatically take us and bring us into those individual areas. Like I say, aligning to a grid or to matching up with the size of dissimilar elements or the space between those dissimilar elements, just as we demonstrated when we were working with Chapter 2 of our InDesign course. Pasteboard options. Now we're working with the area outside of the page. In this case, the horizontal margins are going to be defined at 8.5 inches. So that's the space that's set across. Remember, we have a good amount of space side by side when we're looking at individual pages. And vertical margins, which are actually set pretty close to the top and the bottom of the page as that's defined when we're looking at the pasteboard for each of those individual pages. If we want more room around the outside of our pages for our pasteboard, what we can do is we can adjust these numbers horizontally or vertically to allow more space or less space away from the edges of that page trim area.